pardon me while I jump around here and start at least a little bit over again, just so you can see what the screen share was that I was showing. It was this snapshot here with the strategic paradoxes and the many aspects of my identity here. And there's a link to that video if anybody wants to watch it. This was a video I made a few years ago on Wardley mapping. I also tweeted it not long ago. If you could mute yourself, Joris, that would be awesome. Thanks so much. Okay, why theory informed? Why is theory informed a big part of my talk? Well, first of all, I love them. I find theories entertaining, so there's that. But one of the tangents that I took while in grad school, I said, oops, sorry about that. I just went full screen by accident. One of the tangents I took was into group learning, how teams learn, how organizations learn. And one of the things we read was by Argyris and Schoen. I'm sure a lot of people have come across Argyris and Schoen. And we read a paper called "What is an Organization That It May Learn?" And they presented this idea of the disconnect that many organizations have between espoused theory and theory in use. I'm sure this is quite familiar with a lot of people.
We've lost your screen share again, Sue.
Oh, geez.
I'll keep on telling you because I want to see.
Thank you. Thanks, Mike. Let's see. Is it? It's funny because it still showed it as active on my end.
I think when you said I went to full screen, I think that's what it
yeah. Boy, this is one of those like speaker fails where it's like, you know, dropping pens and things in the middle of your talk.
We'll not let you get away with anything.
Like Mr. Bean. I'm like Mr. Bean over here. Okay. So Argyris and Schoen's espoused theory versus theory in use. And the interesting thing about this to me is a lot of people don't even have espoused theory. It's like we don't even talk about the theory we think we're using. But I don't know. I was totally captivated by it and spent the next, I don't know, since then, I guess it's been about 10 years now, exploring more about group and team learning. So the main context that I've been noodling around with, this is a map from last year from Map Camp. I'm sure you guys can't see this very well. It's a map on a mission for a nonprofit that has a social justice goal to end or at least limit the use of forced isolation in prisons. So it's basically the overarching mission is prison reform. And this was a really useful exploration for me. And I probably wouldn't have done it. I spent months on this because I used a theory that was, I'm going to switch here. This is last year's presentation. This guy, Alnor Ibrahim's Measuring Social Change. Very complexity informed. He's a Tufts Fletcher School of Business. He's got a lot of case studies in here about how what kind of strategy one might use depending on what your outcome is. So he's got these like ecosystem strategy, emergent strategy, niche strategy, and integrated strategy. So I was really curious about applying his theory using Wardley maps to this nonprofit that I'm on the board of. So I'm gonna switch back to today's board now here. So I basically built a mashup of Ibrahim's theory with Wardley map. And it basically acted like, I'm going to stop presentation mode so I can zoom in here on his theory. You know, it's a lot. You can see the parallels with Wardley map, like start with what needs you're going to meet, whose needs, what's the value proposition. what's the results chain is what he calls the value chain, that you need to figure out external accountabilities, because usually as a nonprofit, you're applying for funding, blah, 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 a performance system to know, like, how will we know what we're doing? So Wardley mapping over time might be a way to explore that. So that was last year. And I have a link to that board on the Miro if anybody's interested. At the end of my talk last year, I shared sort of my next steps, like what could I do with all this work that I just put in, months of it. I could share my Wardley map with the board. I had already tried to get the board interested in Wardley mapping and was on the strategy committee. And so I thought it only makes sense that I'll close that loop. I thought I could share Ibrahim's book, maybe start a book club with the board, and share the match that I made between Ibrahim's work and Wardley mapping with Alnor Ibrahim himself. And I did all three of those things. Well, I proposed all three. I met with Ibrahim. It was awesome and fun that he was interested in hearing about this. The board, however, paused all strategy work shortly after Map Camp because we embarked on hiring a new executive director. And so the outgoing executive director, we had a whole year to do the executive director search, and it's just winding down now. But we paused all strategy, all of it, for almost a year, which kind of seems crazy to me, but because needless to say, the board still thinks about strategy as like we have a 5-year plan that we write and then never look at. This has been being recorded, so I'd like to send it to the board because it's been a frustrating experience. So basically, they asked me to take on the ownership of a pen pal program that we run as an organization, and so I did. So then I started mapping the pen pal challenge, which is a much easier thing to map. It's much less tangled, and there's a lot fewer external stakeholders. I basically have pen pals who are incarcerated, and I have volunteer pen pals. And this was all managed by a Google spreadsheet. The most complicated thing we do is forward letters. We handle the forwarding. So I really wanted to evolve the database, evolve the process for responding to pen pal requests, because I was doing that by handwritten letters. And I wanted to evolve. I've noted this as a market of pen pal volunteers. I wanted to expand both the market, mostly the market of pen pal volunteers, because I have plenty of incarcerated pen pals awaiting someone to correspond with. So I've done all three of those, which was awesome. The mapping was just really useful. This is not rocket science for people like who might be here who know about mapping, but to me it was just awesome to have this grounding artifact that I could see my progress. Just having this talk now, just to be able to check these things off was really fun. Marketing has been my next thing because I suck at it. And that became very apparent. Like recruiting volunteer pen pals was really tough. And it was so funny how this has started to move right, because it was just a random conversation that I had with a colleague back from my Harvard days. She's a business professor. She went to HBS. I went to the School of Ed. But she is now at a university and just said, let me reach out to the marketing department and see if they want to make this a project for their students. And I was like, awesome. And so this fall, that hopefully will come into fruition. So that brings me to what's the next theory that I want to kind of mash up and inform Wardley mapping? Because Wardley mapping itself is theory informed, but I'm always kind of looking into the next thing. So I'm just finishing up this animation with USAID on social and behavioral change, which is really a fascinating frame. I mean, it came about, let me pause about why it exists first and say how I understood. It took me a while to understand even what they meant by that. And I used this document created by UNICEF. There's a link on the Miro board. And I should share this in the chat in case people arrived and don't have access to the Miro board. Chat. Okay, just shared that. So this document basically is like a lit review, almost, like from all these different fields. It's mostly drawing from psychology, sociology, and then sort of what exists in the environment to create basically a list of all the things that might be influencing people's behavior. So you can imagine like a UNICEF or a USAID social change effort might be to improve health outcomes in developing countries. And so the behavior might be maternal behavior. It might be how's a mother feeding her kids, or what's the sanitation practices or the hand washing practices. And so a lot of times social international development efforts would focus on the behavior of the mother and think, well, I'm getting ahead of myself. Sorry. They would think like, all we need to do is modify the mother's behavior. You can, I'm going to put a pin in that for a second, go back to like, once they expand all these psychological, environmental, and sort of sociological or social factors, you end up with about 130 factors influencing behavior. And only one small one is that information environment. Like, what does the mother know about sanitation practices? So why make this horrendously complex set of factors for international development programmers, people creating these things? And it's because at least it surfaces, it brings a landscape that reveals the assumptions that you're making about how to influence those health outcomes. The assumptions being made, namely, if people just understood what was healthy, they would do it. But any of us who have lived in a body for, beyond our 30s know that just knowing what might be the wise choice is not enough for us to make healthy choices, of course. So that this whole SBC framework, social and behavior change framework, has been an effort to shift the bets that international development program people make about how to shift the landscape. Those bets in the past have been media and messaging, or training even. I'll put in that same category. But the SBC approach would say, like, okay, number one thing you have to do is formative research to figure out what are the most important, are the things you might prioritize, which I think would be a great dovetail for strategy mapping, as opposed to having the strategy come out of formative research, which is what SBC suggests. Because the arcs are fairly long, like maybe 5 to 6 year contracts. It's like we do the formative research, then we develop a strategy and social network mapping and system mapping and monitor and measurement, and then we execute. Where I think it would be awesome to have Wardley maps in that formative research stage to identify which behaviors to prioritize. So this is an example of a sort of a meta map of all the people whose behaviors might be targeted in a social behavior change, let's say an international development effort. And this was specifically around nutrition. So you see farmers and vendors. An intervention that might come up for maternal health is, you say you need something, I don't know, let's say it's like fish powder, which is accessible in the local area, but mothers can't access it because it's, I don't know, only sold in bulk or something. And so you need to partner with the vendors, really. It's not the mother's behavior that's impeding this whole thing. It's that vendors need to sell it in smaller chunks. And so that formative research is sort of how you find that. So going back to looping back around and sort of reflecting on how does this inform interfaith action for human rights? That's the mission. That's interfaith action. Interfaith action for human rights. It's hard to say. Is the nonprofit that I'm on the board on. Okay, someone's saying they can't see or access the Miro screen. Are other people able to access the Miro board?
No, I had to ask permission, so you have to click on shares.
Sorry about that. You know, when it was embedded, it let everybody do it.
That worked well.
Okay, hang on. Manage access.
It's below that one. Anyone with a link? No.
Thank you.
Yeah.
I'm not going to put a password. I don't need a password.
You can copy the link.
Okay, now, where's the link?
It's the same link as the one you shared already. So
okay. Thank you. Somehow disappeared. Susan, hopefully you'll be able to see that if you can. Thank you for letting me know. Okay. So the bet, thanks, Mike, the bet that interfaith action is making is that if we just make it illegal, solitary confinement will go away. That is the bet, because our entire approach is one about advocacy, legislative advocacy. And this is really frustrating for me because I don't believe in this bet. Like I define, all right. There are so many things here. I'm just actually reiterating the go-to intervention for many health and nutrition programs is the information environment, what they call the communication environment, having scientific information. The bet for interfaith action is that you make it illegal, government entities. Okay, so recently, speaking of bets, Ben Mosier clued me into this book, and I read it, consumed it in short order. And Annie Duke asked you a question about, would you put money on that bet? And that's what really highlighted for me that I don't think that legislators and then everyone that flows from that are the bet that's going to shift the landscape around corrections, specifically around solitary confinement. For me, I think a much more, if I had to put money on it, I'd put money on supporting correctional officers in doing their jobs. A lot of times it's really fraught, it's stressful, and solitary confinement is a tool for managing fear, it's a tool for managing numbers of people, it's a tool for protecting vulnerable populations. Well, if you had other tools, you might use them. They don't need to be this hammer of lights on 24/7, no yard access, no exercise. It's really frustrating to me that correctional officers are sort of framed as the villain in the larger stories. So to me, that makes me wonder, who's already doing formative research on corrections reform to see where would those behavioral interventions be most leverageable? What other emerging options are there? I had these on my original map. Pilot programs like one called True, piloted in Connecticut, I believe. Another one called Amend, which is a partnership between the state of Oregon's Department of Corrections and I think Norway.
In Denmark, they are very active on that as well.
Oh, in Denmark. Oh, yeah. And I mean, even a lot of systems are more progressive than the US. And who else is exploring, a more general question, who else is exploring worthy mapping for social change? So hopefully some of you here are in that space, and I'd love to hear from you if so. So where am I now, and what bets am I making? So sorry, these are just extra questions, which I realized have typos that I made while Simon was talking. So I'm going to stop sharing, but before I go on to those questions, I seem to have, there you are. I lost you guys for a second there, but you're back. So I've been talking a lot and fast. But some questions I have, I loved that Simon said the first thing you see when you map is how wrong it is. I loved being affirmed in that, because every time I make a map, it's like, especially with social change stuff, they're just like spaghetti. They're horrible and terrifying. And so it can't just be me. It can't just be me sitting around stealth mapping in a board meeting. But I don't know quite how to crack that nut, because, you know, if mapping and map reading are sort of, let's say, emerging as a competency, let's say, that's my hope at least, not everybody can read them. And so there's this guy, Brett Victor, who talks about the humane representation of thought. And my education background brings in something about a similar frame, which is universal design for learning, but I think of it more like universal design for communication. Like we need a lot of forms, like drawings and visual narratives and storytelling, like Simon's keynote. I mean, he totally sold me. I didn't know how to read a map, but he sold me in his story about why I should care and why I should learn about mapping. So I don't think mapping can be enough. I think we also have to be good at telling the stories of maps, which I am not. Well, I mean, as you can see, I'm all over the map with my storytelling. And so then my next question, what's next in terms of theory informed? So in the hopper for me for a long time has been David Wood's Theory of Graceful Extensibility. It's a heady piece of work. It took me a long time to read it and make sense of it. Woods comes from resilience engineering, but his questions really center around when cascading failure happens, when things just completely fall apart. And so I think it's an interesting thing to explore, dovetailed with Wardley mapping, is when don't things develop? When don't things move right? Not just because something's getting in the way, but they're already right and they're already invisible, and then they completely fall apart. And the theory of graceful extensibility seems like it might be a good, fun mashup. I'm a big fan of mashups. I don't really like to stick to one theory. I like to take them and juxtapose them with others because it's fun. And then it feels at least like there's some value being added in the play, in the creative play of that space. So I'm going to stop talking now and open it up to questions. And yeah, I see somebody mentioned stealth mapping. I am a stealth mapper for sure. And I've gotten some leverage out of that, but usually with tools that are easier for folks to see their own voices. Yeah, not Wardley map. Wardley maps are hard. I find them very hard. I don't know about you all, but it is a lot of effort. Oh, thanks, Mike. Mike just posted a link to the Theory of Graceful Extensibility paper, which is really fascinating read. Yeah. Anybody else find mapping really hard?
I've been mapping some stuff, and when you have a linear spoken narrative, a lot of assumptions are hidden and assumed. When you're mapping, you really have to know your stuff, which is why it's hard, because when you start off, you don't know your stuff. I thought I knew it. I mapped it and went, yeah, why is that there? What is that line? Should that line be there? What does it mean? You don't ask those questions of a text. And yet, I tweeted to Simon when he tweeted a map, and I said, I'd love to know the story that goes with this. And Simon was like, oh, well, it was like 45-minute conversation, blah, blah, blah. But actually, I think if whenever we gave someone a map, we actually gave them a 3-minute narrative, the understanding that went with the map would be exponential. But that is so hard. Getting those two things together means you really have to have either really understand your stuff or have a way of saying, yeah, I'm not sure about this stuff here. Give me a bit of leeway.
I find it requires a high tolerance for feeling like you have no idea what you're doing. And it's hard to find other people to play with that have that. Ben is just my dream. Ben Mosier. I love getting together and mapping with Ben because he seems to have no problem. I see there's a question in the chat. Susan, you said you had a question about cross-referencing causal mapping. Causal mapping. Say more. And feel free to join in with your camera and or audio, Susan, because I'm curious what you mean by that.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes.
Oh, wonderful. So I'm in one of the learning groups, the education group, and so I appreciate where you're at, Sue, because I have a whole new appreciation for teachers, but we're doing a lot of descriptions, and at the same time I'm working in Kumo with causal mapping, but not in the same groups. And so I tried to actually take the components of wordly mapping and turn it and translate it into causal maps. And so I think it kind of speaks to what you're talking about in terms of, how do you interpret and, is the map going in the right direction? And so I'm kind of wondering if there's not some some checks and balances between the two that would actually spur more learning. I'm almost inclined with our group to say, this actually doesn't make any sense when I try to put it into a causal map. But at the same time, I'm not as experienced in wordly mapping. So maybe it's just my learning curve that's getting in the way.
No, I love this. I love this question. I mean, so a couple things. One, I think it's fun that you guys are playing with Kumu as well, because I find it endlessly entertaining. And I find that the labor for making it doesn't. I haven't found it works as easily to play with others as a sort of sandbox. It doesn't really lend itself well to it, and I just got frustrated and abandoned it. In terms of causality, Ibrahim's book is really interesting because he would say, your strategy. I'm going to share my screen again real quick so you can see. This is from last year's map, which I am happy to share as well. Oops, hang on. I messed up and went Miro board. I tell you, that Miro thing is so enticing when you see it on the share screen, but it's a boondoggle. Okay.
I put it in the chat. I found the link.
Here we go. This is last year's where Ibrahim talks about these different kinds of strategies depending on niche strategy really only works if you have a linear, clear causal connection. But they're all strategies, different kinds of strategies. In Ibrahim's frame, they all lend themselves to wordly mapping. And I think one of the things that Simon just said, which is really relevant to what your question is, he just said it at the end of the more recent talk the previous round that I attended. And it was the danger of taking the maps as truth. So when I hear causal, I think okay, we will all agree that this is the causal chain. And I think in maps, it's it's the avenue to disagree, or perhaps the opposite, to play around with believing. Oh, I see. This is how you see the sort of causal flow, let me try that on in my head. And I can do that because you've laid it out for me. So the believing game and the debate game, I think, go hand in hand. But the maps, I think, I'm a little concerned even about the notion of having causal maps, because learning is not causal. Like, none of it is. Like,
I think it's about
it's just not a frame that makes sense.
So bear in mind that I'm not doing the Kumo maps with the education map, Wardley mapping group. I just kind of see where, if what I did is I took the components of what we have so far, which is kind of a convoluted mess, quite frankly. But I took that and I tried to show the relationships in a causal map. And that's kind of what led me to go, either I really don't know what I'm doing, or I'm starting to realize that we need to really kind of rethink how we are framing up these different pipelines. Okay.
Yeah.
And it may be that we're starting to kind of get stuck in the descriptive mode instead of the declarative mode in terms of communications. And so, and what I kind of come back to, which is an assumption I'm making, which I would love to hear other people's confirmation or challenge on this, is in my studies on negotiation, I find that I don't think most people can distinguish between strategy and structure.
So a couple things, I want to respond to a couple things you said real quick, and then I also want to give other people a chance to respond to it. I'm just a question first. When you say causal mapping, are you talking about Kumu's system mapping?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. Awesome. You are encountering exactly one of my first roadblocks to Wardley mapping. I was like, but where are the loops? Where are the loops? It was driving me crazy. And then Ben Mosher just totally clarified for me. He's like, yeah, no, Wardley mapping is a reductionist sort of atomizing practice, and they complement each other. It's not an or. I think you see more things doing both.
Yes. That was kind of like, why aren't we using them both as almost checks and balances to validate, where we're just getting into a word salad versus actually looking at what the system strategy is that's driving evolution.
I do think that there is a little bit of a trap in identifying that, like mapping the whole system in terms of feedback loops, blah 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 blah, and finding that perfect intervention point. It doesn't exist, and I like that Mike brought us back to the bets. We're just trying to make good bets.
Yes. Good investments. Yes.
Mike.
Yes. Thank you.
The causation maps can be used to surface your thinking. Sue, you mentioned, you're locking people up 24 hours a day equals better behavior. And there's a causal loop there. That's not what the Wardley map of the value chain of doing that looks like. And so if you want a map, you could use a causal loop map to say, what do we think right now? What's our belief? Because what we're doing right now, and why do we think it will work? You've got to surface your beliefs around that.
Yeah.
And causal maps are quite good because you think you're going to do X because you think you're going to get more of Y. But
is it all about alignment, getting people to see many different perspectives of a story, putting it visual, asking like, do you agree in this way?
Yeah.
And then if you have with your boards, for example, and you do the exercise together, not by yourself, but as a conversation starter, and then bring them in and say like, what do you think is missing here?
Yeah.
Or something like that.
I was thinking of starting a lot of arguments with the systems community by just renaming them correlation maps. Because essentially when you're talking about what people think, that's what you're saying. I think doing X is correlated with getting, but other people might see completely different things. And I think, as Sue said, if you don't have them both, you kind of they don't complement each other. Maybe you're losing a lot of context.
Yeah, it's been a point of frustration for me that we have the perspective of some returning citizens and lobbyists and lawyers and former prosecutors and law enforcement in our mix with the mission. We don't have correctional officers. And it has been a tough sell. I did an animation a few years ago on solitary confinement, and I interviewed some returning citizens about their experience. I said, I really want to interview some correctional officers. They're the ones that make the decision in the moment. And I think there's also an element of time, Joris, because the behavior might improve. Like you've taken the problem away when you isolate someone, the troublemaker, the guy who might just knock your block off between now and the end of the day. You've taken that problem away, but what is actually the change in behavior over time, which we know is very bad? It is a desocializing influence. There are people who have spent over 10 years in solitary confinement continuously. Those people really struggle with, we're damaging people's mental health. It's considered torture.
But those are very interesting pilots to run. I see what Mike is typing. Go to the Gemba, go for a project where there is an involvement. And I put it a little bit higher in the chat. I was half participating in a very interesting online conversation, which happens every Tuesday. You can see that I posted the link, and it was about greening the social structure of prisons. And there is our international network of people who are doing projects with prisons.
There
was one in Maine, very interesting. They're gonna go further and further to see how they make connections and change. So if you get connected with those people, maybe there's already an opening for you to get those linked with the wardens and so on.
And I have actually. I spent 3 days in a jail in New Hampshire, a really cool jail, an innovative jail. It was the craziest thing, and they gave me free access, free roam. It was mind-boggling that there were actually people doing corrections this way. And so, but I appreciate all the links and all these suggestions. I want more of them.
Yeah, we can connect further, and I can introduce you if you want.
Awesome. That would be so fabulous. Yes, I definitely want to hear more of these things.
But what I think, because many things are new for me, I'm a little bit aware of the worldly mapping, like learning curve for myself. But if I see when you are presenting, it is of course quite overwhelming. And if you don't take the time to zoom in and make the connection or the documentation of why this is here and why this is there, it is a bit like storytelling, but it's much more like that you ask the people who watch it, is there any like a Q&A about it? If you go very fast over it, it goes into your eyesight and it goes away, and it's overload of information because it is
the tension. This is why I make animations, because when I start talking live, it's like trying to drink from a fire hose, right?
But only people who are super interested will take the time to go back to the Miro board, for example, and zoom in and try to figure out. But there needs to be some verbal communication with it.
I am always open to mapping. Mike and Van Mosher and I did live mapping where it was much more the pace of let's put this thing on the map and let's describe why we're putting this thing on the map. And it's a very different thing. And I struggle with it because doing that live, like I would love to do that live. That's
practicing, I'm not there yet. So
that happens at Map Camp very often, but I'd love to do it. Mike, were you going to say something?
I was just wondering if all maps should be animations where you explain why you're putting things down.
Well, interesting you say that, because based on the talks that I just heard this morning, I started mapping. Like, one of the things that I realized in all this is, like, maybe my bet isn't with this nonprofit. Maybe I need to fledge and go elsewhere. And it reminded me of Richard Hackman's research on successful teams. I'm not feeling, he says a team is successful if it, I'm going to do this live. I'm going to do this live because I made the map. I might as well do it live. This is online Wardley mapping for those of you who don't know. Where is it? I can't quite see. Here we go. I called it collective efficacy for some reason. But so most of the time we just think, okay, a team is successful if they meet the needs of their stakeholders. Hackman said, we also need to get better at what we do over time. And individual happiness matters, which seems weird. That was one of the things that I studied in grad school for group learning. I was like, I want to understand individual happiness, and my professor was like, what? So I'm trying to do this in real time and connect these. It's harder than I thought, but I'm gonna start to, let's see, successful collaboration. Do the lines. You can sort of see how I'm creating a value change here. That value chain, that successful collaboration depends on these three things. That's Hackman's theory, Richard Hackman. Individual happiness depends on both. It's like a balance of frustration and fulfillment in your work on the team. And I would suggest that there's a connection between a team getting better at what it does and shifting each member's frustration to fulfillment quotient. And I made this in the map, I made it a flow just because I don't see where that is. Oh, there it is. Because it highlights the connection. That's actually a ratio. So I cheated and I used the online Wardley mapping flow indicator, which is this blue. So for me, I think tools for making thinking visible are key to a team getting better at what it does. And so I'm just going to connect these things up now. Whoops. So what are some tools for making thinking visible? Well, Wardley mapping is one. I mean, in grad school, tools for making thinking visible we had an entire, Project Zero is all about making thinking visible. Learners. If you make a learner's thinking visible to themselves, it helps them learn. You don't need to tell them if they were right or wrong. Just say, let me know more about your thinking. So all right, this was my attempt, my probably not so great attempt at some live mapping, and walking through a story. I don't know if it was useful, but I did it so fast in like the 10 minutes I had between the last round and this round, and I was like, okay, like it's a case for having these skills, whether it's Wardley mapping or something else, just diagramming the system map, or using Kumu, or using a pen and a paper or whiteboard or whatever it is. Sorry for talking so much, y'all. It's like, once you start, it's hard to stop. But
That was, thank you, Sue. I recently used Wardley mapping to kind of work out what I wanted to do to write a book of stuff. But I actually, and it's a visualization, and I've actually run workshops called Just Draw the Thing, where there's like 10 different ways of drawing something, and pick a couple. especially the ones you don't think will work. See what you learn. And so I've just had a massive validation that that's useful. That's on the value chain of getting good, isn't it? And wordly mapping is one of the most advanced ones. So maybe that's why starting to feel a little bit like a map shock.
Yeah, broad and
that's
deep.
Again, there's all sorts of way more similar stepping stones you can get to.
Yeah. Well, I'm conscious.
When you used to.
So I think you cut out there at the end, Mike, but I do want to make sure people have time to stand up for 5 minutes before you run to the next round. I could use the same. Thanks, everybody, for coming. Please do get in touch if you have thoughts or want to map together or want to connect me with anybody doing stuff in this realm. I'd love it. I'm at Contemplate This on Twitter.
Thank you. Nice meeting you all.
Well, I'll stick around in case anybody wants to ask something.
Thanks, Sue. Be in touch.
Thanks, Mike. Thanks for coming.
I'm gonna drop off. I send a message on LinkedIn, so I'll follow up
Oh, great.
there.
Thank you, George.